So he goes more in depth than we're going to go, but that may be of assistance to you as well. So there was a prophet, a claimed prophet. He claimed to do his prophecy by means of astrology and reading the stars and all of that. And he went to his king, and the king asked him to prophesy, and he told the king, "I'm afraid to tell you that your favorite horse will soon die." And turns out he was right. So within a very short time, that king's favorite horse died. So the king was now enraged and upset. He even thought perhaps this prophet caused the horse to die. So he summoned the prophet and said, "All right, prophet, tell me when you will die." He's mad. Prophet senses, all right, he's about to kill me immediately. And you can see the tough position that puts him in, because if he says, "Well, I'm about to die right now," then he says, "All right, you're right," and he kills him. But then if he says, "I'm going to die later," the king says, no, you're a false prophet, because I'm about to kill you now." So the prophet thought for a moment, then he said, "Well, king, I cannot foresee, I do not know the moment in which I will die. But I do know that whenever I die, the king will die 3 days following." Prophecy is attractive. Prophecy is enticing. Prophecy is something that generates a lot of excitement. And yet, we all understand the draw to approach prophecy often from a selfish perspective. How does that impact me? What can I do with this? How can I get right up to the line? How can I make a big deal about this? Because, hey, it's prophecy. And we're reminded of those challenges as we walk through this section of Daniel chapters 10, 11, and 12. Remember, these are pulling back the curtain passages. As God not only pulls back the curtain to how he works with angels and sending these messengers, angels to help his servants, but now in this chapter, especially when we find the vision recorded, we see God pulling back the curtain of history a little bit. And he's looking forward to show Daniel some details and some changing of nations and how all of this is going to directly impact his people, the Jews. And just quick reminders, but these are all pillars we need to keep in mind as we walk through this text, that the value of seeing prophecy foretold and then fulfilled in the time to follow is that it proves the inspiration of all Scripture. Because we know God fulfilled these things, we can know that what he says to do about anything else is from God. The other value is that because of the purpose in telling us these prophecies, and because he's telling us it's going to get bad, it's going to get worse, but we still win, that gives us hope. And we always need to remember that there is the great doctrinal value in seeing these things fulfilled, but there's also great inspirational value to each of us to keep going, because we serve the God of history, the God of all time. And always keep coming back to, in this vision, Daniel chapter 10 and verse 14, the angel telling Daniel, "Here's what I've been doing. Here's why I came to you. I came to make you understand." Came to make you understand. Daniel, what is to happen to your people in the latter days? What's to happen to your people? Your people, the Jews. That's Daniel's burden, and he's coming to answer that burden with this vision. And Daniel understood it. Daniel understood it more than we understand it would seem. And it still challenged Daniel. It even kind of haunted Daniel. It caused physical responses in Daniel. So as we read it, whether it's in class tonight or in the week in between, and we get a little bit of a headache, or we confuse people, we don't know what's going on here or there, we're in good company, because it challenged Daniel too. All right, quick summary. We will not read verses 2 through 4, but just quick summary. Remember, these 3 verses cover a lot of ground, about 180, 190 years. We see that the Persian Empire is the one who is in power when Daniel has this experience. And so he says, you're under King Cyrus right now. There are going to be 4 kings that follow Cyrus. And the 4th, Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, as he's known in the book of Esther, he's going to accumulate great wealth. But he's going to make a significant error. And it may not seem like an error at the moment. A lot of time is going to pass after it. But he's going to go attack the Greeks, and he's going to be unsuccessful. So a lot of time passes after that unsuccessful battle. But what happens then is, because he is unsuccessful, those Greeks begin to grow in power. Eventually, it is Alexander the Great that comes on the scene and takes over virtually the whole known world under the name of the Greeks. And so chapter 11, verses 2 through 4 move us from the Persian Empire into the Greek Empire, and then even past the rule of Alexander the Great. Just fast forwards through a lot, because he's trying to get us to a point that matters for the Jews. Alexander the Great dies suddenly at the age of 32 or so, and instead of having one consolidated kingdom, they end up with 4 kingdoms divided amongst his generals. Now, the reason, in looking back, the reason this is important to note, and we look at God's providential hand, is that Greek culture spreads throughout the known world. Because Alexander the Great was able to conquer all of the lands that he did, this emphasis on learning and this emphasis on Greek culture, Greek mythology would be included in that. And other things that brought the world up to speed in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their desire for knowledge and their thirst for those kind of things. Hellenization is what it gets called. That culture had spread because the kingdoms spread. And so just as under the reign of the Romans later, peace spreads, culture spreads to the Greeks. And we see the most direct influence on our Bibles through this spread of Greek culture, because the New Testament is written in Greek. And it's written in what's known as Koine Greek, not classical Greek. So you've got higher end, harder to read classical Greek like Homer and all those kind of things. But then you've got the Greek of the everyman. And that's what the Lord inspired the New Testament to be written in, which is Greek. And so we see, even though the vision is about something else, it does reveal some things that end up being helpful and important in the time of the New Testament. The 2 main kingdoms that are emphasized in this vision, there are 4 that are mentioned to begin with, but then only 2 become emphatic. The Ptolemies to the south, which would be Egypt, and the Seleucids to the north, which is Syria. And we see why they are mentioned when you look at them on the map. Because they are joined together directly over Jerusalem, over Judah. So Daniel's up in Babylon, which would be, in Seleucid territory on this map. Daniel's up in this area. And when they come back home all the way down here, they're eventually going to be in the time now under Greek rule where these 2 kingdoms are battling back and forth for who's going to control that land. Why would they be, besides them being rulers and leaders just wanting to amass as much land as they could, why would this little strip of land be especially important to those Greek rulers of, the 200, 300, 400s BC? Strategic, it's on their coast. That's some truth to that. What kind of land was it agriculturally? For the most part, this is desert, and yet God said it's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's still an important place geographically, and they're fighting over it. And so when you see this back and forth, it's who's going to control this fertile area of land. All right, so the summary is for verses 5 through 20. We read all the way through 20 last week, but the summary is it's a back and forth between the north and the south, and it's prior to the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. All right, so all we need to just notice in terms of summary is the back and the forth. Back and forth, back and forth. This is how we summarize, how we went through it as we read it last week. In the first 2 verses, the north gains prominence. That means the north, the Seleucids have the power in the Holy Lands. And then the south kind of gains an upper hand. And the north takes an upper hand. And then by the time you get to verse 14, you've got both sides amassing great resources, great armies. It really has that feeling of this is once and for all. Whoever wins this controls the land. That's essentially what happens. And the Seleucids end up continuing to defeat the south, and they run them out. Okay, so what we're going to do now is walk through these sections again. Number one, it's a good thing to do because repetition is how we get familiar with things. If it's really, really, really hard, one of the hardest things you've ever read, the first time you read it, that's okay. Take notes of the few things you do understand and I can identify. Jot down a few questions you have. Sleep on it. Maybe read some other things for a day or two. Then go back to it a second time. And every time we are familiar with it, it'll get a little more easier to handle. All right, so who wants to read? My left hand. We can call this the south side of the auditorium, I suppose. Who wants to read verses 5 and 6 over here? Okay, so we're not necessarily going to address every single detail in the text of Scripture. Unless you have a question and want us to, we'll try to dig into it. But we will try to just go over a quick summary of what happened in history, and you can look back at the text and see how those are working together and are the same thing. Okay, see how it is prophetic toward what actually happened. So the Ptolemy in the south is mentioned first in verse 5. And you'll notice it says, but one of his princes shall be stronger and shall rule. Now what's interesting is what happens in history is that when you have these kingdoms divided up into four, the general who takes over the Seleucids, the kingdom of the north, actually had been finding safety in the kingdom of the south in Egypt. And so he's getting protection from Ptolemy the first Soter. He's finding protection from him until he's able to then go up into Babylon and rule over the Seleucid kingdom. That's what happens in history. So you'll see in the text it says the king of the king of the south, Egypt, shall be strong, and one of his princes shall be stronger than him. Well, he's one of his princes because he was under him for a while until he moved up into that northern kingdom and became the leader of that kingdom. All right, so you can see how there would be a little bit of an amicable relationship with each other. If they'd spent time with each other, they were both under Alexander the Great, and then Seleucus the first, Nicator, spent time with him in Egypt. What do? They try to create these alliances, and daughters and wives and such get thrown into those situations quite often. So what's he do? You'll see it in verse 6. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. So they send an Egyptian daughter up to the Seleucid territory, and that Egyptian daughter was named Berenice. Berenice. Well, guess what? Antiochus II in the north already had a wife. So what does he do? He divorces his wife, puts her away, sends her off in order to marry this new Egyptian woman. Then he changes his mind. So he welcomes Laodicea. I don't really know how you pronounce that one. But it's not Laodicea, that's the city in Asia. But he welcomes her back. She takes out revenge. She assassinates the ex-husband who put her away. She assassinates Berenice and her son, who would be future ruler of the Seleucid territory. She gets revenge. So you see how that creates a mess, and you see how, in verse 6, this Berenice will not retain the strength of her arm. He and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up. Her attendants, he who fathered her, he who supported her in those times. It's an unsuccessful attempt at an alliance, and it creates even more intrigue and drama. It fails. All right? So we see these kind of things happening in certainly in movies and all those kind of things, and dramatic TV shows that try to be historical. And here you see it. It's the back and forth, the playing of these kind of chess pieces to see who can gain an upper hand. All right, let's move into verses 7 through 9. Middle section. Who wants to read verses 7 through 9? Okay, so in the south, in Egypt, you've got a guy who begins to rule named Ptolemy III. And verse 7 calls him from a branch from her roots. Who's the her? Back up to verse 6, the Berenice. Well, she's got relatives. Ptolemy III is her brother. So what's he got on his mind? What happened to Berenice? The daughter sent from the south to the north. It failed. She was assassinated by the previous wife. Now you've got the brother who's in the south. What's he got on his mind? Revenge. More and more revenge, right? The ex took out my sister, so now we've got to go take care of business. Okay? So that's what happens. Ptolemy III marches into the north to avenge her death. Now, there are battles back and forth that last about 5 years. You see that in verses 7 and 8. He goes to the fortress of the king of the north. He shall deal with him, shall prevail. Now, when he is successful, he takes the spoils, and he brings them all the way back to Egypt, down south. That's something you could track, something you could verify from history. Was there this moving of precious goods from the north to the south? And we do know that that's what happened. Now then what happens is it's pretty clear that Egypt has gained the upper hand for the moment, so things kind of cool off. He and the other Ptolemies just kind of decide to hang out and not attack more. And you've got the northern king in verse 9. It says the latter shall come into the realm of the king. Apparently what happened is this Seleucid king, Seleucus II, tries to come down and maybe tries to take a piece of land just without being seen or noticed, or maybe he tries to amass a group of troops to go down and take some land from Egypt or attack them, but somehow he is stopped, somehow he retreats, so nothing ever becomes of it. But it's clear by the end of verse 9, Egypt has, for the moment at least, gained some prominence. Now, what we need to see here is verses 5 and 6. They were trying to do things clearly not respectfully, not with dignity, but they were not just going into all-out battle, right? They were trying to use the negotiation kind of tactic, right? And we see world leaders do that all the time today. Let's talk about it, and let's pretend like we're going to bomb and do war and all that, but let's just try to negotiate and talk about things and send goods and send money and all this kind of stuff. Well, you see them doing that 5 and 6. Well, now you see 7 through 9, they've begun to actually invade. They've begun to make these personal matters. But even still, even though they're doing that, no one has established themselves as the dominant empire. So even though things have escalated, there's still no resolution, there's still no upper hand that is firmly settled. All right, 10 through 13. The more northern side of the auditorium, my right hand. Who wants to read 10 and 11? We'll cut it in half. 10 and 11. Okay, somebody from our left-hand side, finish us out 12 and 13. Okay, so the north regains prominence in this section. You see that by the end of verse 13. But what's clearly happening is that both sides are no longer just trying to go about it as little skirmishes or just kind of personal back and forth. They've now said, all right, this is business. Let's amass as many troops as we can. And let's go about this as trying to become a dominant world empire. So that's why you see in this section they're both stockpiling and creating these multitudes of troops and resources. And what's interesting is that you often see it as the king of the south. Well, verse 11, he's moved with rage, and he shall raise a great multitude. But then, the very next clause is, it shall be given into his hand. And so a lot of times with the king of the south especially, you see that it's portrayed as though he's going to be the one to figure all this out. He's going to be the one to once and for all put his foot down, and then he gets snuffed out. And that's showing us that the king of the north is doing just the same. He's amassing great armies. He's being successful in squashing out the Egyptians. All right, so by the time you get to verse 13, that last phrase, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies, that's cluing us in on now Antiochus III, also known as Antiochus the Great, is now the guy. And one thing, I don't think we've mentioned it directly, but it's what makes this text confusing, or a little more confusing, is that you see the phrase, the king of the north. And then it says, after some time well, it may not be the same name, the same individual that it was when he was mentioned a verse or two before, but he's still the king of the north, right? We would do that with, in 1986, we talk about the president did this. And then in 2006, we say the president did this or he did this. Well, it's not the same name. It's not Reagan, but it's still the president. That's kind of what's going on here. He's still the king of the north, but he's not the same dude. He's not the same guy. So by the time you get to the end of verse 13, it's Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great. All right, so let's go into verse 14. This is where things get really interesting as it relates to the people of Daniel, the people, the Jews who belong to God. Let's see where we can cut it off. Let's go ahead and get through verse 16. Someone read for us. We'll go over the center section, middle section, 14 through 16. Okay, we'll go ahead and stop there, just since we're winding down in terms of time. But let's break down 14 through 16. In terms of the history, what's going on with these leaders in the map? You've got the northern king, Seleucid king, Antiochus III, and he's called Antiochus the Great. You can see from his description in this text why he's called the Great. Many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. All right? Then the king of the north, verse 15, shall come and throw up siege works, take up a well-fortified city. The forces of the south shall not stand. or even his best troops. So there shall be no strength to stand. The Egyptians are going to mount their best effort, and it's still going to come up short because they're going up against Antiochus. Which Antiochus? Antiochus the Great. Verse 16, he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him. So they're going to come against him over and over again, and they're going to keep running into him, and they're going to do as he decides. His will is always going to be stronger. Then listen to the last sentence of verse 16. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. Amazing how that rhymes in English. But where is the glorious land? It's the glorious land. Yeah, it's the purple star. It's Judah. It's Jerusalem. It's the Holy Lands. It's Palestine. Whatever you want to call it, that's where he's now planting his flag. And so you can see how this has brought us to a very important part in the vision. Because now the angel is telling Daniel there's going to come a time when one of these forces will once and for all stake their claim to this part where your people are going to be living in again. Now verse 14 is interesting because that's the first reference to the people of God in this vision. The violent or the robbers among your own people shall lift themselves up. What they're doing is they're seeing this mass accumulation of forces on both sides. And they especially see the south getting pretty frightening and pretty domineering. And so they say, hey, we're going to choose the north. So that when the south comes up against them, they attack the south. They attack the Egyptians. They're not all of them. Okay, the robbers among your people, the violent among your people. So we just see now, as of verse 14, the Jews are inserting themselves, at least some of the Jews, are inserting themselves into this back and forth. Can you see the temptation? I mean, here you are, you're living in a common area that's under attack constantly. Can you see saying, it's about time we pick a side? And by the end of verse 16, which side had they picked? Winning side or losing side? What? They picked the north, and the north is the side who, quote, for the time being at least, for the foreseeable future, is the, quote, winning side. Until Rome takes over, it's these folks that are the dominant empire. All right. Good job, people of God. You picked the right side. You can see how that's building, right? All right, so that's through verse 16. Verse 17 continues to increase the drama. And it's interesting because we would, I think, be quick at this stage to fast forward and just kind of turn our attention to the north. And yet it's not going to be that seamless that the north takes over. But it's a very key factor in getting us to verse 21, which introduces Antiochus IV. And he's the big bad dude that's going to be a problem for the people of God. So, what questions do you have? Yes. That's going to be a little later. Yeah. I mean, that's going to kind of tie into a lot of this. That's leading up to it. Yeah, well, a lot of it's going to be in what we have come to call the Apocrypha. All those extra books in the, quote, Catholic Bible. Yeah, that's where, and I've got a friend who teaches at Freed Hardeman whose emphasis is on the 400 to the time of Christ. And he says we say it's the silent period because it is. They didn't hear from God at all during that time. But more Jewish literature is produced then during any other time of Jewish history. Sure, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. All those are developing while all this is going on. Yeah. And so what that means is we have history. And we can't take it as gospel. We can't take it as inspired. But we do have a lot of history. And we do have a lot of insight into their culture. And so while these things are happening in real time, they're documenting what's happening, or they're documenting what they're responding to. It's this time period, really later, but apocryphal type literature, apocalyptic literature begins to happen. But yeah, it's very much related to all that. And essentially the Maccabees were ones who separated themselves, and then they decided we've had enough, we've got to come do something. And they come in and they have this mini revolt and kind of drive them out for the time being. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, so you got three, really, right? You got North, South, Jews, all logging all this history. Yep. That's a great point. We see how all those forces of history align themselves to verify these things are happening. That's a great observation. All right, what other questions do you have? Thank you for your time. If you got more questions, let me know. Let us know for next week. We'll do our best to keep working through it quickly, but also just trying to handle it appropriately and respectfully, all right? So we'll for sure finish out through verse 20 next week. Hang in there. Don't get discouraged by it being difficult. Keep coming back to it, and we'll keep learning and growing however we can.